Hello, random people, beautiful people. And today we are going to be doing the election series,
Okay.
part
SeatGeek handles the tickets, so fans
7.
can fan.
Beat presents Presidential Elections in American History. The 39th presidential election in American history took place on November 5th, 1940. The
1 second, please.
We've got our vision, and at Floor and
Great
Decor, there's so
Depression
much to
dragged
choose
on,
from.
and-
But with free in-store design services, our budget and our time are well spent.
With our wide selection of products, all at everyday low prices, creating a space to match your taste has never been easier.
1 second, please. I had to make that shit up.
Now another world war was being fought all across Europe and in Asia. Franklin Roosevelt, or FDR, had remained popular despite the fact that his New Deal policies had become increasingly liberal, for lack of a better word, and despite the fact he tried to pack the Supreme Court so that more of his New Deal policies would not be struck down as unconstitutional. While the economy had showed signs of recovering early in FDR's second term, it suddenly went to crap again soon after that. Many former FDR supporters began to lose faith in him. Former allies now were enemies. Al Smith, for example, constantly criticized FDR and had even supported Alf Landon for the 1936 election. After the court packing attempt, Vice President John Nance Garner turned against FDR and said he would run in 1940. That didn't seem to stop the majority of the country from supporting Roosevelt, which is why there were rumors that he might try for an unprecedented third term. FDR had told several people he had no intention of running again, as that would break the two-term tradition set by George Washington 144 years prior. His wife, Eleanor, said he shouldn't do it. At the Democratic National Convention, Garner and FDR's former campaign manager and the Postmaster General, James Farley, were the two leading candidates for the nomination. But enough key people influenced the majority that only FDR could keep the New Deal policies going, and it was he who once again got the nomination, with Henry Wallace, the Secretary of Agriculture, as his running mate this time. The Republican Party, who some said would die after the embarrassing defeat of Alf Landon in the 1936 presidential election, found new life when in 1938 they gained a lot of seats in Congress. The downturn of the economy certainly sparked this. By 1940, they thought they were ready to take FDR down. Still, the party was divided between the interventionists, those who wanted to become more actively involved in what became known as World War II, and the non-interventionists, those who wanted to stay out of the war. Three Republican candidates stood out. Robert Taft, the son of former President and Chief Justice William Howard Taft, and a senator from Ohio, was a non-interventionist. Then there was Arthur Vandenberg, a senator from Michigan, who leaned a bit non-interventionist, and Thomas Dewey, the district attorney of New York County, who leaned a bit more interventionist than the other two, but was still a non-interventionist. Dewey got the most votes early on, but was criticized for his youth and lack of foreign policy experience. All three candidates had weaknesses, actually, and only 300 of the 1,000 delegates had been pledged to a candidate by the time of the Republican National Convention. This left an opening for a dark horse. That dark horse had a really cool name, Wendell Willkie, a lawyer, businessman, and former Democrat who had never previously run for public office. Willkie had a passionate core of supporters who won most of the rest of the Republicans over. Interestingly enough, Willkie was an interventionist. The Republicans nominated Charles McNary, the Senate Minority Leader, as his running mate. Even though McNary had tried to block Willkie's nomination at the convention, no third party stood out at all during this election. Unlike
Alright, so as far as my vote goes, I guess, you know what? Country's a shit. I'm not very faithful in FDR at this point. I guess I'm voting for Wendell Willkie. Because he seems like he actually has hope for this country, unlike some people. Alright, let's go.
Landon in 1936, Willkie is mostly tended to support Willkie. He also dominated the popular, and vegetables blamed at this time for the Depression. And Willkie, he received 449 electoral votes in another landslide victory. He also dominated the popular vote, getting 54.7%. Wendell Willkie finished with 82 electoral votes and 44.8% of the popular vote. Henry Wallace became the 33rd vice president in American history. There was a strong contrast between urban and rural in this election. Americans in the big cities mostly tended to support FDR, while Americans in smaller cities and in rural areas mostly tended to support Willkie.
It's 1912.
I'll see you for the next presidential election, buddy.
Folks, will you help me start my campaign off strong by donating today? Every generation has a moment where they have to stand up for democracy, to stand up for their fundamental.
Mr. Beat presents Presidential Elections in American History. The 41st presidential election in American history took place on November 2nd, 1948. After Franklin Roosevelt died, Harry Truman took over.
Oh, I'm sorry. I entirely skipped the 1944 election. Little bit of spoiler there. Sorry, guys. I skipped an entire election.
Mr. Beat presents Presidential Elections in American History. The 40th presidential election in American history took place on November 7th, 1944. Almost 3 years earlier, the Empire of Japan attacked an American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. 2,400 Americans were killed and 1,200 wounded. The attack also damaged 5 battleships and 3 destroyers, and 7 other ships and more than 200 aircraft were ruined. It took most Americans completely by surprise, and the next day, President Franklin Roosevelt asked Congress to declare war on Japan, which they promptly did. Soon after, the United States also found itself at war with Nazi Germany, joining the struggling Allies. This war became known as World War II, and it's the biggest war of all time. By Election Day 1944, the war was going much better for the Allies, as the forces of both Japan and Germany had severely weakened. Roosevelt, or FDR, had become a popular wartime president. Unlike in 1940, he did not hesitate to run for re-election during this very critical time. The Democratic Party mostly supported him, and he was renominated. However, most conservative Democrats were uneasy about renominating Vice President Henry Wallace, who they argued was too friendly with labor unions and those wanting to end racial segregation in the South. Some recommended Harry Truman, the senator from Missouri who was more moderate. Truman had made a name for himself fighting fraud and waste in the war program, but FDR didn't know him very well. FDR trusted and liked Wallace, but gave in to the pressure from the Democratic Party to have Truman be his running mate instead. Even with Truman's nomination, several conservative Democrats were not happy. For years, they had not liked the way both the New Deal and the war effort expanded the federal government and hurt business. After the Supreme Court decision Smith v. Allwright, which said a Texas law saying it was okay to discriminate against African Americans in Democratic Party primaries was unconstitutional, they became even more upset with FDR and the party establishment. This group became known as the Texas Regulars, and they ended up breaking away from the Democrats. They were purely a protest group, and they never could even agree on another candidate. The main goal was to prevent the re-election of FDR. The Republicans again had many folks interested in their presidential nomination. Wendell Willkie was interested again. Thomas Dewey was interested again. Robert Taft was not. Instead, Taft told everyone John Bricker, the governor of Ohio, would make a fine president. But some former Taft supporters gravitated toward General Douglas MacArthur, who was then leading Allied forces in the Pacific theater of the war. Another leading contender for the nomination was Harold Stassen, who ran for president pretty much every 4 years for the rest of the century. He had been the governor of Minnesota when he decided to give up the position to fight the war in the Pacific as a naval officer. Well, this time the Republicans went with Dewey, who by this time was the governor of New York and had become more of a national figure anyway. They chose Bricker as his running mate. It was a fairly strong ticket, but interestingly enough, Wendell Willkie, the Republican nominee of 1940, had not endorsed them. In fact, Willkie had been pretty friendly to FDR since the last election, and some even speculated that Willkie could have been FDR's new running mate instead of Truman. No one would find out what he was truly thinking, however, because Willkie died on October 8th. On the campaign trail, Dewey talked trash about how FDR needed to lay off the economy and shrink the size of government. Now that the end of the war was in sight, FDR argued he was just doing whatever necessary to win the war, and most Americans generally agreed with him. There was one issue. Some doubted FDR could make it another term, as his health appeared to be on the decline. Because of this, the Democrats had to sell his running mate, Harry Truman, and...
Actually, from now on I'm going to let the full video play because there are some important facts within it, but my vote goes to FDR because the economy's now fine, and FDR is looking to win this war. And disclaimer, I don't know that FDR is going to die. I don't know it. I don't know it at all.
And here are the results. FDR won, becoming the first and only president in American history to be elected for a fourth term. And he kicked butt again. He received 432 electoral votes and 53.4% of the popular vote. Thomas Dewey finished with 99 electoral votes and 45.9% of the popular vote. But don't worry, he'd be back. Harry Truman became the 34th vice president in American history. FDR's decision to go with him proved to be pretty important, as Roosevelt died the next April, less than 3 months after beginning his fourth term. It was Truman, not Henry Wallace, who would become the country's 33rd president. Within a few years, the Constitution would be amended to prevent presidents from ever serving more than 2 terms, mostly because of FDR.
To you can be better than
I'll see you for the next election, buddy.
you are.
So if there's not going to be anything left at the top, then you just put one over.
Mr. Beat presents Presidential Elections in American History. The 41st presidential election in American history took place on November 2nd, 1948. After Franklin Roosevelt died, Harry Truman took over, and soon after, Nazi Germany surrendered to the Allied forces. Now, all eyes were on the Pacific theater of the war. Japan was clearly suffering, but it didn't seem like they were going to surrender anytime soon. I mean, Japanese pilots were conducting suicide attacks, known as kamikaze, aimed at warships. While some historians debate whether or not the Japanese government was actually ready to surrender in the summer of 1945, Truman took action and decided to drop the first and only atomic bombs ever dropped on another country. He did it to end the war quickly and to try to save the lives of millions of both Americans and Japanese who would have kept on fighting otherwise. While today people still debate whether or not the action was justified, it's hard to deny how bold the move was by Truman. And it worked. Japan finally surrendered shortly after Americans dropped 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The war was over, and this time Truman made it a point to not make the same mistakes that were made after World War I. Instead of punishment, Truman called for aid. He pushed for the Marshall Plan, which had Americans give money to Western European countries to help them rebuild their economies after the war. They would also help rebuild Japan. Truman's presidency was a huge turning point for world affairs. Sure, World War II is over, but now he was all about fueling the Cold War with the Soviet Union. Truman was cold with Joseph Stalin the moment he took over, and some argue he helped start the Cold War with his strained relationship with the Soviet dictator. I guess who could blame him? It's not like Stalin was a lovable kitty cat or anything. Truman's foreign policy objectives became famously known as the Truman kitty catter.
The sex. Actually, I'm not gonna show you on the channel. But Stalin is no lovable kitty cat or anything. I'm just joking around. Let's continue the video.
That's fun.
or anything. Truman's foreign policy
making a video,
objectives
which is
became
why I didn't
famously
show you
known
on
as
camera.
the Truman
You post it on
Doctrine, with the
YouTube.
main objective being always to defeat communism wherever it appeared. Truman called for aid to Turkey and Greece, where communist revolutions threatened, and he supported the Berlin airlift, basically giving the middle finger to the Soviet Union. Back home, Truman was the first president to actively call for civil rights legislation. He even desegregated the armed forces. I've read several quotes by Truman that are pretty racist, and maybe he did this just to get the black vote, but man, this was a huge step in 1948. Anyway, after all this, Truman had a very low approval rating. It seemed not nearly as many Americans liked him like they did FDR. Not only that, several people in his own political party were turning against him. They tried to get Dwight Eisenhower, the World War II hero and former chief of staff of the United States Army, to be the nominee instead of Truman. But they failed, as Eisenhower refused to run. Eventually, the Democrats went ahead and went with Truman as their nominee, with Alvin Barkley, the Senate Minority Leader, as his running mate. Though Truman tried to moderate his civil rights positions, some Democrats were like, nuh-uh, and walked out of the Democratic Convention. They started a new political party called the States' Rights Democratic Party. Members of this party became known as Dixiecrats. The Dixiecrats wanted to keep a policy of racial segregation in the South and allow states to keep their infamous Jim Crow laws. They nominated Strom Thurmond, the governor of South Carolina and the guy who led the walkout of the Democratic Convention, for president, and Fielding Wright, governor of Mississippi, as his running mate. Fielding Wright, more like Fielding Wrong. Sorry, bad joke. Anyway, it wasn't just the Dixiecrats who left the Democratic Party. Some Democrats argued that Truman's civil rights reforms didn't go far enough for blacks. They wanted more. Former Vice President Henry Wallace, who, remember, would have been president if it weren't for Truman taking his place in the 1944 election, disagreed with Truman on many issues. In fact, Truman had fired Wallace from his position as the Secretary of Commerce after Wallace talked trash about Truman's foreign policy. Wallace opposed the Truman Doctrine and wanted to get rid of the House Un-American Activities Committee, which he thought violated civil liberties. Wallace also called for more regulation against giant corporations and an expanded welfare state. Naturally, opponents called him a secret communist. Wallace and his supporters would also leave the Democratic Party to form a third progressive party called the Progressive Party. Can't we get more creative with names? Again, this was not the same Progressive Party as Teddy Roosevelt or Robert La Follette. It was a new one. This Progressive Party officially nominated Wallace as their nominee, with Glenn Taylor, a senator from Idaho, as his running mate. Taylor had earned a reputation as being that one weird politician in D.C., a guy known as the Singing Cowboy because he would sing songs and ride his horse up the steps of the Capitol. Not at the same time, mind you. So Wallace and Taylor were definitely unique. When they campaigned, they made a point of speaking to racially integrated audiences, even in the South. And because of that, Southerners sometimes threw food like eggs and tomatoes at them. Oh crap. I spent so much time talking about Democrats and former Democrats that I almost forgot to talk about the Republicans. Well, they tried for Dwight Eisenhower too, but after Eisenhower declined, many familiar names stood out for the nomination. Thomas Dewey, Robert Taft, Arthur Vandenberg, and Harold Stassen, who were all in the running in 1944, and some who didn't run in 1944, notably Earl Warren, the governor of California. The Republicans decided to play it safe and go once again with Thomas Dewey, who was still the governor of New York. They nominated Warren as his running mate. Dewey and Warren, as governors of two of the largest states in the country, made up a strong ticket, and with the Democratic Party fractured, nearly every poll favored them to win. Dewey made sure he did whatever he could to just avoid major mistakes. He often was vague on policy and in speeches. As I said before, Truman was not a popular president and even had a hard time raising money for his campaign. Shortly before Election Day, journalists were so confident that Dewey would win that they went ahead and wrote articles ahead of time proclaiming him as the next president. And here are the results. Dewey won. Just kidding. And what is considered to be the greatest election upset in American history.
Oh, I let the results play before I voted. I'm sorry. I would have voted for Harry Truman because... Actually, no. I would have voted for Thomas Dewey because I believe he would carry on the racially integrated policies while carrying on my favorite economic policies. So I would have voted for Dewey.
Harry Truman won, remaining the 33rd president in American history. No one seemed to see this one coming, and yet Truman had won by more than 2 million votes. He sure had some fun holding up this news.
Oh, yeah, he did. Oh, yeah, he did. Miss Hicks.
Hey, buddy.
Look, Truman sure had some fun holding up that newspaper.
Ooh, I remember that. I mean, I've seen that picture.
Dewey defeats Truman. He sure had some fun doing that, didn't he?
Newspaper, Truman received 303 electoral votes and 49.6% of the popular vote. Thomas Dewey received 189 electoral votes and 45.1% of the popular vote. As expected, Strom Thurmond did well in the South. He received 39 electoral votes and 2.4% of the popular vote. While he didn't receive any electoral votes, Henry Wallace received a solid 2.4% of the popular vote as well, getting just under 19,000 votes less than Thurmond for fourth place. Alben Barkley became the 35th vice president in American history. The election of 1948 will forever be known as the underdog election, inspiring future candidates who were behind in the polls to think they always had a chance.
All right, thank you for watching. And I'll see you for the next elections, buddy. I'm kidding. I'll see ya.